Have you ever heard the phrase, yeah, but we know from science that, or, but science tells us? Chances are you've probably heard or used this phrase within the last couple days. I hear it all the time, if not in face-to-face conversation, then online on social media, or I read it in an article somewhere. We use this phrase, science, to add authority or credibility to an argument that we're having. The reality is, though, if I was to ask you right now, could you define for me what science is? Could you do it? My guess is probably not. The reason for that is there's still a lack of consensus within the scientific community itself as to how to properly define science. And so today on the podcast, that's what I want to do. I want to address the question, what is science? Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Science and Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Mario Russo. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's great that you're here. Today we're exploring the question, what is science? So before we get started, let me tell you that there's a couple ways that you can get in touch with us. If you have a question or a comment, or you're looking for resources on the topic of science and faith, you can send, first of all, check out our website, scienceandfaith.de, that's scienceandfaith.de. Or if you have a question that you want to send to us, have answered, maybe possibly have it featured as a future episode here on the podcast, you can send us an email. That's scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. That's scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. You can shoot us an email, send us your question, a comment, and we'll do our best to respond to that. And like I say, who knows, maybe we'll feature it as a future topic or question here on the podcast. So, today's question, what is science? How do we define science? So as some of you may already know, I studied biology as an undergraduate student at the University of South Carolina. And so I remember throughout my biology studies, like one definition that we kind of used throughout the department was the exploration of the natural world with the use of the five senses. And so that's kind of an interesting definition for science. The problem with that is, what do you do when there are people who go out in the natural world and use their five senses to observe the world? Are they actually doing science? So for example, I know a seminary professor who teaches New Testament who is an avid bird watcher. He loves birds. And so on his vacations, he'll go to exotic places, or he'll go to random locations making observations. He brings his binoculars with him. He brings a notebook with him, and he writes down his observations. He'll make notes of behavioral patterns, stuff that he sees. Maybe he discovers a new species. Does that make him a scientist? I think according to this definition, we would have to say, even though he's a seminary professor and he's not trained in biology or in ornithology, which is the study of birds, we would have to say that, technically he's a scientist. He's going out into the natural world and he's making observations and he's writing them down and he's using his five senses. But he's not a scientist. He's not conducting experiments. He's not posing hypotheses and then testing those hypotheses. So he's not really a scientist. He's just a guy going out in the natural world using his five senses to observe nature. So then what we have to do is we have to say, okay, then what is science? And I think there's a definition that we can use to define what science is. Science is the systematic pursuit, gathering, and application of testable, intellectual, and practical knowledge about the universe. So science, and if we break this down real quickly, what is science? It's the systematic pursuit, gathering, and application. Those three words are very important. So, actually, four of them are really important. It's not just a pursuit. It's a systematic pursuit. There's a system involved with the collection of data. Okay, so you can't just go out and observe birds in nature and then write it down in your notebook and boom, you're a scientist. That's not sufficient scientific data. So there's a systematic approach to it that involves the scientific method. Okay, that is the pursuit, gathering, and application of testable, intellectual, and practical knowledge. So we pursue knowledge, we gather the data or the knowledge, and then we apply it. We have to say what this means. As scientists, we have to go out and when we collect the data, we have to come to a conclusion. And we have to apply this data that we see. So if we say, we applied medicine A to a bacteria, and the bacteria decreased by 50%, that's data. That's scientific. That's just data. population was reduced by 50%. But now we have to apply that knowledge as scientists. We have to say that this antibiotic is effective on bacteria, or we have to say it's not effective on bacteria. We have to make a judgment call. So the knowledge that we gather has to also be applied. And then lastly, of course, it has to be testable. That means that if I'm saying that the data says this, another scientist somewhere else in the world, in a different environment, in different context, has to be able to reproduce the experiment that I say I did and get the same test results. If it's not reproducible, if a scientist cannot go into the lab or go out into the natural world and make the same observations, perform the same tests, collect the same data, and form the same conclusions, then it's probably not officially a scientific pursuit. Okay, so it can't be defined as science. And of course, this is intellectual and practical knowledge about the universe. So that's a very important phrase to end the definition on, about the universe. We're talking specifically about the physical universe. So when somebody says, yeah, but we know from science that there's no proof for the existence of God, is that a scientific statement? No, it's not. Why? Because science is the systematic pursuit, gathering, and application of testable, intellectual, and practical knowledge about the universe. When you say, we know from science that God does not exist, you have now left the realm of the universe, and you've moved beyond that. In other words, you've moved beyond the realm of science. So you are making a non-scientific statement. When you say, science proves that there is, or science has no proof that there is God, or science has proved that there is no God. These are not scientific statements because they are outside the realm of science. They are outside the realm of the physical universe. And so you can't make a scientific argument for or against the existence of God. This is very important. So then this leads us to talk about the two remaining points. These are very, very important when we're talking about science. Now that we have a definition of science, there's two remaining questions that we have. And the first one is, what is the scope of science? And what are the limits of science? So the scope, that is, where can science go? And the limits, where can science not go? Where does science end? Its ability to answer questions or investigate truth or make claims that can be falsified or verified. So first of all, let's start with the scope of science. So as we've already said, science investigates the universe, the physical world, the natural world. That's where it goes out and does its best. When I was in undergraduate school studying biology, one of the things I did was I would go out into nature, and there was a specific area of land that we were doing research on, and we were collecting samples from the soil, and we were making observations about the vegetation that was there and the wildlife that was there, and kind of just collecting data. And one of the things we wanted to find out was, that I wanted to find out in my research, was how the soil moisture varied over time and what effect that had on organisms. So one of the things I would do is every week I would go out and I would collect a sample about that much in a jar of soil. And then I would bring it back and I would weigh it and I would take the weight and then I'd put it in an oven and I would dry out the soil and then I'd weigh it again. And the difference in the weight was the amount of moisture that was in the soil. And so I would write that down, and then I would know how much moisture was in the soil based on the weight. And then I would look at what organisms were in the soil. And I would keep track of the types of organisms in the soil based on how much moisture was in the soil. And so what I was essentially doing was I was trying to figure out if moisture has an effect on the types or the number of organisms in the soil. And so one of the things that I noticed was that the higher moisture content there was in the soil, the greater number of organisms there were in the soil, and also the greater variability, the different kinds. There were more kinds of organisms in the soil. So it was greater number and also a greater variety of organisms in the soil. And so then I would write that down and eventually I wrote up my findings into a paper and said, this is what I found, was that these are the effects of moisture that moisture has on organisms in the soil. that falls wonderfully within the realm of science. Going out making observations, it's testable, it's repeatable. Other scientists can follow what I've done. They can take my experience, my experiments, my methods. They can go out and do it themselves, and they can find, hopefully, similar results that I found. That moisture plays a role in the number and the variety of organisms in the soil. So that's kind of the scope of science. It's investigating the natural world. And whether that's, that applies to all kinds of different fields, botany, flowers, plants, animals, microorganisms, cells in the human body, the development of animals over time, whether that's evolutionary biology, it all falls within the scope of science. So then what are the limits of science? Where can science not go? This is a really vital and important question because it's been popularized by a lot of loud voices, guys like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, not a scientist. But so sticking with this with the scientific realm, we have guys like Richard Dawkins who argue that natural selection, not God, is sufficient basis for explaining how life arose and how such complex life and complexity and beauty in nature can be explained without God. It can be explained by natural means. More specifically, he argues through natural selection. So he's making an argument that science explains complexity. We don't need God to explain how complex life arose. Therefore, God does not exist. Can science do that? Can science say that that natural selection explains how complex life arose, and therefore we don't need God? No, not really. Dawkins has half an argument, essentially. What he says is natural selection can explain how complex life on Earth developed. If he stops there, then he falls within the realm of science. He's saying that natural selection is a natural mechanism by which we can explain how complex life formed on Earth. But he doesn't stop there. He takes it beyond the universe, beyond the natural world, beyond the physical material realm, into the supernatural, and says, therefore God does not exist. But that's not a scientific claim. The border for science stops at the natural world. So science has nothing to say about whether or not God exists, whether or not there's a supernatural world, whether or not there's a spiritual realm. Science cannot investigate that. It cannot falsify or verify those claims. It falls outside of the purview of science. And so that's where Richard Dawkins gets his argument wrong. That's where his argument goes bad, is when he leaves the scientific basis for his argument and ventures into the philosophical, which is whether or not God exists. And that's really important. It's important for us to recognize our limits as scientists, using a good, helpful, and encompassing definition for science. We need to recognize that there's limits to that definition, and there's limits to where science can go. There's limits to what questions science can answer. And so I think what guys like Dawkins do is, unfortunately, they promote science, and they're kind of the loud face, if you will, of science. But what they do is, rather than just stick to science, they promote something called philosophical naturalism. And philosophical naturalism is a philosophy, not a science, that says science is a good enough philosophy. It turns science into a natural investigation into the natural world, and then turns it into a philosophy to answer philosophical questions. And that is something that is completely different from science. It's philosophical naturalism. And that is what guys like Richard Dawkins and the New Atheist movement kind of purport, is this idea that science can answer our philosophical questions. But that in itself is an inherent conflict, because science is not philosophy. And the border stops for science when you start bumping up into philosophical questions. And you need philosophy to investigate the philosophical. You can't use scientific tools to investigate philosophy. And I use this analogy because I think it's helpful for people. Trying to use science to investigate or answer philosophical questions is like trying to use a microscope to examine the moon. You can look through a microscope at the moon, and you might get some information from that. You might get this, it most likely is just going to be a bright, blurry, light blur. That's all you're going to get. You're going to get some information from that, but you're really not going to be able to get anything helpful in terms of answering questions like, what is the moon? How big is it? What phase of the moon is it in? Why are there phases to the moon? What is the moon made of? What color is the moon? Things like that. You're not going to get helpful answers to those questions using a microscope to investigate the moon. What you need is a telescope. You're using the wrong instrument to look at the moon. And so when we use science to ask and answer philosophical questions, we're using the wrong tool. We need to be using philosophy, theology, those areas, those fields, to answer the questions about the existence of God and things, and the meaning and purpose in life, not science. Another area, another boundary, or where we're talking about the scope of science, the limits to science. Another area where science is limited is in the area of ethics. Science cannot tell us what is right and what is wrong. Science cannot tell us that murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, theft is wrong. It may be able to analyze criminal data, but it can't tell us what's right and what's wrong. It can't make moral or ethical judgments. Beauty is another limit to science. Science cannot tell us what is beautiful and what is not. Science cannot tell us why certain things are beautiful, or why beauty inspires certain reactions and things like that. It's just outside of the purview of science. It's one of the limitations to science. So science cannot answer philosophical or theological questions, but it can provide insights to the natural world, which is helpful for philosophers and theologians. So as long as science sticks to its field and sticks to what it does best, which is the investigation of the natural world, then science is fine. It's when science tries to venture out into the philosophical and theological, tries to investigate those realms and answer those questions, that it gets into trouble. And so I think a good definition for us to stick to, a good answer to the question, what is science? Science is the systematic pursuit, gathering, and application of testable, intellectual, and practical knowledge about the universe, the physical universe. And so that's the answer to the question, what is science? Pretty simple, but also in a lot of ways pretty complex. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. So glad that you're here. We release a new video podcast every single week, and we hope you check it out. Please be sure to subscribe. If you like the channel, give this video a thumbs up. Share it on your Facebook or Twitter feed. We really appreciate it. Helps get the word out and helps spread the message around. So we appreciate it. If you have a question, send us an email. Email address is here on the bottom of the screen. Be sure to send us your questions and themes, and check out our website, scienceandfaith.de. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.